For this day, I will discuss about aesthetic. So first, um, um, what is aesthetic sense? Aesthetic sense is concerned with the study of the mind and emotion in relation to the sense of beauty. Having a sense of the beautiful, characterized by love of beauty, relating to involving or concerned with pure emotion and sensation as opposed to pure intellectuality. But let's have a review for now on what is aesthetic usually. Well, aesthetic defined as about beauty and taste or the appreciation of beauty. But the full story of aesthetic is um, aesthetic is called the Zenith science, and this bring into important issues associated with classical aesthetic, the notion of science or knowledge and reason, and the sunset of or the involvement of the body in the experience of art. So, what is notion? Notion is like a concept of science. It's just a science that pursuit, uh, notion of science that pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. So, aesthetic also is now associated with art history, uh, art history and philosophy rather than visual culture more generally, and is a set of knowledges, theories, and practices that address the nature and value of art object and art experiences. So, aesthetic and what do you call that? Um, they are now related to the philosophy of art, which is concerned with the nature of art and the concept in terms of which individuals' work of arts are interpreted and evaluated. Um, Now is Plato. Plato is the earliest writer on aesthetics. His notion was the reality consists of archetypes or ideal forms, which are the models of for all the objects in the social world. So, for Plato, is the job of the philosopher was to reason on the basis of the object about what ideal it was imitating. Well, he said that the job of the artist was to copy the object as exactly as possible and thus end up making a copy of a copy. So Plato asserted that when artists are making or performing art, they are imitating or they are the art imitates physical things, objects or events. So Aristotle followed Plato. So Aristotle uh, was the student of Plato. So Aristotle followed Plato in writing about aesthetics, but paid less attention to the ideal and more to the order and unity of an object. Um, so Aristotle wrote about this particularly in his Poetics part of it, and speculated form of contemporary viewpoint that anything either tiny or vast could it be beautiful because its order could not be discerned clearly and in one moment of time. Well, beauty for Aristotle was dependent upon unity and sense of the whole. So more than 2 millennia later, or more than 2,000 years later, the logic of object and the judgment of taste have changed. Philosophers have lost faith in ideal and transcendental realm. So, after how many years or 1,000 years, you have lost faith on art. So, philosophers have lost faith in ideal transcendental realm in order to unity, are no longer the most privileged form within the art world. So after the more than 2,000 years, they lost their interest to ideal transcendental realm. But the the idea of order still had currency in the early days of aesthetic. Mm, One of the first to write extensively about aesthetic was Alexander Baumgarten, who posited that aesthetic refers to the whole realm of human perception and sensation. Um, its history in the physical rather than strictly conceptual. Um, um, but nonetheless, it engaged with the whole interest in reason and was aesthetic sense an attempt to understand and bring under the order of reason and which seemed to be outside its scope, the emotional or sensate realm. And then, um, well, in fact, Baumgarten termed aesthetic the sister of logic or urge of inferior that is a feminine analog of reason and hence inferior in terms of logic. So the next is aesthetic judgment. Well, aesthetic judgments refer to the ideal beauty. Mm, it based on various principles such as beauty, harmony are derived from our interaction with the natural world. Well, Immanuel Kant is closely identified with the discipline of aesthetic associated sound understanding with judgment in the critic of judgment. This is yeah, he wrote this in his book named the Critic of Judgment. In his estimate, the ability to judge of work is dependent upon clarity of thought and knowledge and not the emotion. So he dependent on how the knowledge of the artist that he that he put in his art, not the emotion. So for Kant is for Kant beauty is estimate was not simply something that might bring pleasure. In fact, Kant writes the analytic of beauty, the delight which determines the judgment of taste independent of all interest. So Kant writes, like Plato, Kant considered the order and the form of beautiful object to be based on universal rather than particular principle, and hence to exist outside of the subjective test of an individual observer. This meant that for Kant, sensual gratification and personal sentiment were excluded from judgment of taste. Seeing something as beautiful meant seeing is an image rather than as a real object. So, so um, the aesthetic object was to be regarded in terms of its formal qualities, its harmony and proportion, for instance, rather than in terms of its practical desirability as an object to be consumed. So we can explore this by looking at the painting that painted by Domenico Beccafumi. So this is the Madonna and Child with Infant John Baptist. Um, Beccafumi and his 16th century audience may have made of this work. We have this of work 19th century philosopher of aesthetic would insist that the base and the only valid way to approach the work would be stand back against it in disinterested fashion. So Madonna and Child with Infant John Baptist uh, was painted by um, Beccafumi. So in way back in 16th century or 19th century, the philosopher of aesthetic that insists the look, paint with disinterested or they have no appreciation of that art. So, next is the aesthetic of pleasure. Aesthetic pleasure comes from contemplating something intellectually and, in the case of visual and performing arts, perceptually as well, focusing of the object and its properties. The philosophy of aesthetic made an account of their immediate sensory experience but ended up valuing its formal universal character. Michael Maffesoli is who writes that where conscient aesthetics is concerned, the accent plays, plays less on the artistic object as such than on the process that leads on the admire the objects. And the aesthetic wrote expressly, but the sentence elements of the aesthetic pleasure, that spur of sensation that was amenable to aesthetics, was somehow above the beyond actual sensation. It was committed to process and reasons. Um, this means that in practice of the art view, as the art viewer, as a good aesthetician, cannot be personally and viscerally moved by beautiful objects. Any pleasure taken must be pleasure in the beautiful forms, for instance, rather than an actual body, something that leaves the pleasure of erotic, imaginary, rather undergrounded. So theological imperative is also associated with the other side of aesthetic, the obverse of beauty, which Immanuel Kant named the sublime. Kant described its finds detail in his analy- analytic of the sublime. Unlike the beautiful, which is something that delights on the base of its form, Kant writes um, the sublime is to be found in an object of even devoid of form so far as immediately involves or else by its presence provoke a representation of limitlessness, yet with a surrounded thought of its totality. So the sublime terrifies rather than the delights. And the delight in the sublime is a negative pleasure because it reminds us of our limit within a limitless world. So at the end of this discussion, let's have a short quiz. So number one is he is the early years writer on the aesthetic. His notion was the reality consists of archetypes, ideal forms which are models for all the objects in the social world. A. Immanuel Kant, B. Plato, C. Aristotle, D. Michel Maffesoli. Next is he said that the beauty was dependent upon unity and sense of the whole. A. Aristotle, B. Plato, C. Immanuel Kant, D. Aesthetic pleasure. Next is he is closely identified with the discipline of aesthetic associated sound understanding with judgment. A. Immanuel Kant, B. Plato, C. Aristotle, D. Michel Maffesoli. So that's all for today. Thank you for listening my discussion.